What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you know this is going to be a best of compilation. I somehow managed to strain my neck by moving it in the wrong way, so it really hurts whenever I put my headphones on to record. Because of that, I'm going to have a best of today, then Sunday's compilation as usual, and then if it's still not feeling better by Monday, I'll record shorter videos, probably 20 to 30 minutes instead of an hour. Until it's finally better. I hope you guys will enjoy the video anyway. If you guys are enjoying these daily videos and you end up enjoying this one, please be sure to comment, share, like, and subscribe. Doing all of those really helps out the channel and ensures that I can keep doing these daily videos for a long time to come without having to stop or take any breaks or anything. Without further ado though guys, I will let you get right into the video, and I will see you guys again at the end. This happened when I was living at university. I'm a woman, and at the time I was living alone. I was living in a really small town called Hikashi Kawaguchi. My home phone was ringing, and I answered it. The voice on the other end asked, "Is this Emily? I'm calling from the only hospital in this particular town." We spoke for a while, and this person said they were a doctor who specialized in some sort of medicine. This all came at the time coronavirus was at its peak in Japan. It seemed to be some sort of courtesy call. I was happy enough to listen to this doctor's advice. The only thing was, I'd never heard of this doctor before, and I'd never had an appointment with him either. Usually when a doctor calls or when you call your doctor, they already know all your personal info like your name, your home address, etc. The doctor should have all the information about your last visit as well, right? He asked me a few questions and I confirmed the answers. Everything else seemed to be completely above board. He then asked me to participate in a questionnaire about my personal life. I thought to myself, why not? If it helps people during this pandemic, that can only be a good thing, right? He began to ask me some questions. It was okay at first, but it started to get weird pretty quickly. It began with completely normal, non-offensive, and non-intrusive questions. For example, have you had a cold or cold-like symptoms lately? Have you been to the hospital in the recent past? As he continued on, the line of questioning changed though. What kind of clothes do you like to dress in? What are you currently wearing? Then he asked me, did you know that breast cancer is on an increase at the moment? What cup size are you? That can really be a factor. I refused to answer. I gasped when the doctor then said, I think I'll need to pay you a personal visit. I'll be there in 7 minutes. The phone then hung up. I stood there shocked, gripping my phone. I bolted out the front door and ran to stay with a friend. I stayed there through the whole night. When I went back to my place, I was really glad to see that it hadn't been burgled or anything. I'm an idiot, so I didn't call the police to make a report. The more I thought about that creepy call, though, the more I started to get a bit frightened. This was not some guy trying to get his rocks off. This was not a heavy breather call, not some neck beard either. This guy was methodical. What was extra spooky was the fact that he said he would be at my apartment within 7 minutes. And that really stood out to me. Usually, if people are making things up, they'd say something in a multiple of 5, right? But that was really precise. I checked Google Maps and saw the hospital was over 15 minutes away. It was so weird. I didn't get a call like that again either. That was a bit of a relief, as this had been playing on my mind quite a lot and making me look over my shoulder everywhere I went. As time went by, my feelings of fear towards this guy turned to feelings of anger. I didn't want to live my life scared. My friend suggested that if I really wanted to figure out who that call was from, I should ask the phone company. Well, I called the phone company up, and we found out the call had come from a payphone pretty close by. It was exactly 7 minutes away. Half a year had passed since then. I still had that creepy call in the back of my mind. Then one day, my home phone rang just as I was heading out to work. I picked it up. "Hi, I'm from AT&T. This is the cell phone company. We've been trying to get in touch with you. As I understand, there's been a bit of a dip in service in this area. We wanted to get in touch and see if you're experiencing any issues yourself." I was in a rush and didn't really have time for this, so I said that I couldn't help. They then said they would call back at a more convenient time. I told them I wouldn't be free until after 6. Thank you. For callback purposes, could you let me know your cell phone number? I'll call you back after 6 p.m. I was a bit hesitant because of what happened before. "Well, why don't you just give me your information, and then I can call you back myself when I get home from work. How about that?" The line immediately went dead. Was this happening all over again? When I went to work, I told my boss about what happened, and he decided we should call the cops right now. Whoever was doing this was definitely trying to get to me while I was home alone. I didn't feel safe anymore. I had no idea if I was being watched or what. I flinched every time the doorbell rang. I decided to just move house eventually. I'm pretty sure that I'm safe now, as I've moved quite far away. Maybe the guy from the hospital and the guy from AT&T were the exact same person, but I couldn't really tell by just the voice, since it had been so long between. This was only a year ago. At the time, it had been a while since my last camping trip, and for a few months leading up to this, I was really just wanting to get out and camp like I always used to do. Finally, I had gotten some time off work and planned out a trip right away. There were some mountains not very far, about a 2-hour drive away from me. There were plenty of trails on them. I scrolled through the pictures, but eventually just decided to choose one. Once I got there, I wasn't too worried about the trail itself. I really just wanted to sit by my tent and relax. I drove up the mountain with 4 days' worth of camping supplies and food. This wasn't really a popular destination that people came to a lot, so there weren't very many parking areas. I ended up finding a plain dirt lot on the side of the road and just parked there. I then got out and started walking along the road until I got to one of the camping trails. On the very grayed out map, it showed the trail went a few miles into the forest, then up the mountain and split into 3 different paths that all led to various camping spots. I figured this would work, so I started the hike. It took just under 2 hours to get to the 3 paths I'd seen. I saw no difference in any of them, so I just picked the left one at random. About 30 minutes later, I came up to the camping grounds. It was an open area with not that many trees. Nobody else was there, and it didn't look like anyone had been there in a long time either. Everything had grown over, to the point where if there wasn't a direct path leading to this place, it would look just like any other spot in the forest. I tossed my bags down by one of the trees and started building up my camping area. I sat down on a log and made my lunch. After that, I just kinda sat there, writing in my journal and listening to the birds' songs. Once the sun was starting to get lower, I had to get a fire going to keep me warm. I got up and walked around the perimeter of the camping grounds to find sticks to use. Not too far from my tent, though, I found something quite strange. There was a path leading off into the woods. It was clearly not a regular trail, though. This was obviously a footpath, which had been formed by someone walking this same route over and over. Usually these types of paths grow over quickly when not in use, so the fact it was very clear and noticeable was incredibly odd. I finished collecting all the sticks and prepped the campfire, but something about that path there made me feel uneasy. I just wanted to check out what it was really quickly before camping the night right next to it. I grabbed my bag and started following this thin trail. The more I walked on it, the more I was sure someone had been there recently. After a 15-minute journey, I reached the end. Out in the woods just beyond this path, there was a small cabin. It looked like it was decaying and abandoned. The wood was splintering, and entire boards were missing. The door was left wide open. I walked up to it and looked around, wondering why this footpath would lead to this abandoned hut in the woods. It was far too distant for someone to stumble upon it out of curiosity. I peered in through the doorway. It was dark inside, and I couldn't really see much. I could tell that it wasn't empty. There was something inside. I was about to take a step in when a sudden voice behind me startled me. "Go away. Leave right now," a man said, very sternly, almost furious. I turned to face him. Standing about 10 feet away was a man. He told me to leave again. Without saying a word, I did exactly as he said. I walked away. I looked back once more, seeing the man standing at the edge of the path and watching me. I guess to make sure I was really leaving. Once I got back to my tent, it was already dark out, but I was not going to stay there. I quickly packed up and left, dangerously hiking in the pitch black with just a flashlight until I got back to my car. I don't know what was going on there, but what frightened me so much was that I was immediately sure the man I'd seen did not live there. He was wearing perfectly clean clothes, had no equipment, and there was no signs of him being out there for more than a couple of days. That makes me question why he was out there in the first place, and why he needed me to leave so urgently. How did the footpath even form if he didn't live there? Or was there someone else who did that? The whole thing has me asking 100 questions, and I don't think I'll ever get any of the answers. I own a janitorial business that specializes in cleaning office buildings for mid to large size companies. Due to the nature of the job, we start our shifts at 6 p.m. on weekdays because most offices don't want us inside during business hours while all their employees are still working. On this day, I got to the scheduled office building at 6:30. Putting in the keypad passcode and getting all my equipment in, then locking the doors behind me. The building was only 2 stories, which was much smaller than most, but both floors were really big. There was also a smaller basement level. I started on the 2nd story and wanted to work my way down. I went around grabbing all the trash, grabbing anything off the floor that would get in my way, and then tied up the bags and brought them out to the dumpsters at the back of the building. While I was out there, though, I noticed 2 parked cars. Neither of them were on, but what was really odd about this was that this was the only building nearby, and supposedly nobody was supposed to be here right now. I just didn't know why they would be parked out back of the building, or where the person could even be if not in their cars. I went back inside and double-checked that all the doors were locked up. I continued on with my work, but occasionally checked out the windows to see if there were any changes with the vehicles out there. Everything seemed to be the same. I finished up with the top floor and moved my way down to the 1st floor, doing the same process. This time when I went out to toss the trash in the dumpster, though, I noticed a single light was on in one of those vehicles. Almost as soon as I stepped outside, it turned off. Something about this made me uneasy. I quickly tossed everything and went back inside. Seeing that someone was actually in there made it even more odd. I tried to work faster, finishing the floor by 11 p.m. That was much quicker than the previous one. Now it was just the small basement level, and I'd be all done. I moved everything down and got to work. This level was mostly full of boxes. It was more of a storage warehouse area. While I was down there, I heard a thud echo through the building. It had come from one of the floors above me. I couldn't tell much of what the sound was or on what floor it was either. All I knew was that it came from above. I put down my things and started walking up the steps. I stopped halfway through when I heard voices coming down the upper hallway. Two men were talking back and forth at a regular volume, like they weren't even afraid of me being in there. I slowly crept back down the stairs and moved behind one of the boxes. I went to dial 911. Before I had the chance to say anything, though, the footsteps began making their way down to the basement. I only saw the man's shadow on the wall. Before I completely hid myself behind the shelf of boxes, I heard him walk around and then yell upstairs to the other man. "Hey, I don't see him. I think we're good." He walked up the steps and I peered out one more time, seeing this shadow. I could tell he was holding something small in his hand. I reconnected with 911 and explained what I could. I waited there for several minutes. During this time, the men were mostly on the top floor, then moved back down to the first. Suddenly, one of them yelled, "Hey, the van is still here!" Both of their footsteps started rushing around, but not leaving. They were clearly looking for me. It was hard to control and quiet down my breathing, hearing them running and searching through the building, moving things around right above me. Their footsteps rushed down to the basement stairs as one of them began throwing boxes around, looking everywhere. The sounds of sirens approaching caught the other man's attention, who alerted the one in the basement. Both of them ran away. I stayed hidden until an officer came down to get me. It took 2 hours for the suspects to get apprehended. They declined to share why they'd broken in, but a few stolen items were found in their cars. It's safe to say they weren't the smartest, as they seemed to just guess whether I'd left rather than start by looking for my van to see if I was still there. Regardless, them not leaving after finding out I was inside was probably the scariest thing I'll ever experience. Thankfully, I didn't have to find out what would have happened if they'd found me. I'm a 24-year-old male, and a few years ago I picked up a job at a local grocery store. I was doing community college and just wanted some money to help pay for food and going out with friends. After a couple of months of working there, I started to get used to the regular customers that came in. Most of them were nice and otherwise average people, but this one guy always had something weird about him. He came in most nights around 9 p.m., which was an hour before closing. He would walk around the store for a long time before eventually returning with 1 or 2 items and checking out. For how long he would spend walking around every night, it was really weird that he'd always only end up with a couple of things. He didn't ever talk much, but I assumed he was living on the streets or out of his car. That would explain why he only ever got a few things, and his clothes were never clean. He just kinda looked unkempt all around. Anyway, this went on for several weeks, if not months on end. I never thought too much of it after a while, because it was such a normal part of work now. One night he came in as usual, but instead of walking around the store, he came right up to the register. I asked if he needed help with anything. The man just kinda looked at me for a second, before asking if I drove an old Toyota that was out in the parking lot. I immediately found it a bit weird that he would know that, but I said yes because I didn't see where this was going. I thought maybe there was something wrong with my car. Instead, the man kept a straight face and walked away immediately. Obviously, this was really weird. I asked my coworker to watch over the registers for a moment. I went out to the front of the store and looked out into the parking lot. My car was right where I'd parked it and didn't seem to have anything wrong with it. I went back inside to the register, thinking I would ask the man when he came to check out, but he never did that night. I don't know when he left, but the store closed without him ever coming like he usually would. When I left, I checked all around my car and nothing seemed off about it. It left me totally confused as to what that was all about. The next day, I planned to ask the man again, but he didn't come in for the whole next month. The man never showed up again. I was just left to wonder why he'd asked about my car seemingly out of nowhere and for no reason. On a Saturday night, I clocked out of work as usual. This was the one night of the week where I'd be the only cashier, so at the end of the night I was always left by myself. When I began walking through the parking lot toward my car, I got this real strange feeling in my gut. I just remember something feeling wrong. Maybe there really was some intuition about something. It was really unnerving me. I walked quickly and got in my car, glancing around the lot. It was pretty much empty and had nothing to give me reason to believe that something was wrong at all. I turned my car on, and just before I put it in drive, I heard the slightest sound from right behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the mirror that was facing my back seat. I left the car running as I sprinted out and stood a few spaces away, looking at my window to the back seat. I could see a figure moving around. I turned and ran for the store, going back in and calling the police. By the time they arrived, my car was empty. There was no signs of forced entry either, so they had to have some illegal key copy or something. Or I'd have to have left the doors unlocked by accident. I'm fairly certain it was the strange man from weeks ago. But I didn't know why if it was him though. Maybe he had been trying to get in there for the entire month I hadn't seen him, and was waiting for me to forget to lock the doors. I think that I locked them that night, but every once in a while I do forget without even knowing, so I can't write that off completely. The man that was back there clearly wasn't just trying to rob the vehicle. He even tried to stay hidden after I'd gotten in and turned it on. It's horrifying knowing that I was so close to having left that parking lot and drove away unknowingly with the person in the back seat. Once we'd left, who knows what would have happened. They might have waited until I pulled into my house, or I may have never even gotten home that night. This happened March of last year. I was living in a really cheap apartment complex. It was all I could afford at the time. The apartment was tiny and my neighbors were a lot older than me. The vibe of the building was very much single dudes. One night in March at around 2 a.m., I was lying on my bed reading a book. I have a habit of staying up late. All of a sudden, I heard a loud banging sound at the door. Someone was trying my door handle as well. It sounded like someone was trying to kick the door in. I could hear it shaking with the impact. I thought it was someone annoyed and making some sort of complaint about noise, but I hadn't made a single sound in the last 2 hours. I didn't have the TV on and I wasn't playing music either. I'm not ashamed to say I was absolutely bricking it at this point. It was really frightening. I managed to muster up enough courage to creep over to the door and put my eye to the peephole. I saw a guy out there I had never seen before. He looked to be about 50 years old and had this totally insane look on his face. I didn't understand why this guy was so pissed off. I hadn't ever had any trouble with any of the residents here. I didn't really want to do so now either, but after 5 agonizing minutes, it was clear this guy was not going to give up hammering on the door. I thought it would be better to talk to this idiot. Before he woke up the whole damn building, I put the chain on the door and slowly opened it. The instant I inched the door open, a knife jutted through the gap. It danced its way toward me. I pushed on the door as hard as I could, and thankfully the owner of the knife seemed to be weaker than me. The door closed shut the whole way, and everything fell silent. I didn't get a good look at the guy's face. I shouted through the door, "Hey, what the fuck was that?" I never got a reply. I just heard someone board the elevator and it departing. Could it be that someone had mistaken my room for another? Did someone on this floor have a grudge against another person? What kind of grudge provokes a spontaneous knife attack? I thought the residents here were all older anyway. None of this made any sense. Everyone in the building seemed mostly nice, and there had never been any trouble as far as I knew. I just couldn't figure it out. I couldn't do much about it either. I decided I couldn't do anything but get some rest. I had to work the next day anyway. Yes, I know I should have called the police, but I didn't do so. The following night, or if I should more accurately say the following morning, the same thing happened again. The same psycho showed up at my door, knife in hand. I was scared and angry now. The adrenaline was really pumping through me. "What are you doing? You've got the wrong guy. Who does this at this time of night?" I shouted all kinds of stuff, hoping something would make sense to this guy out there. I grabbed a big piece of wood. It was part of a shelf that had recently come down. I was ready to knock some sense into this guy. I was also ready to call the police. I just didn't know which was going to be the most effective first. I decided to take one more look at the peephole. The guy was just kind of standing there in a daze. I got a good chance to look at his face, and that's when I began to recognize him from somewhere. I had only ever bumped into him in the lobby a couple of times. He always made small talk with me and seemed like a really nice older guy. He'd even asked me if I wanted to have dinner with him one of those times. Well, I was really glad I didn't accept that invitation now. I think he lived somewhere below me. I couldn't get my head around this. Why was he now just randomly attacking me? I called the police right away. I kept silent all the while he continued to hammer on my door and try the lock. Anyway, to cut an incredibly frustrating story short, the guy was interviewed by the police when they arrived. I gave my statement, but as far as I can tell, he made it out like he was totally innocent. He pretended he knew nothing about what happened. The cops patronized me and kept asking me if I was under the influence. They warned me not to lie to the cops. Well, I knew what I'd seen. What frightened me the most is that he got away with it so easily. Would he do it again? The police wouldn't do anything about him, I realized. I bumped into him a couple more times before I moved out. He would just smile at me and put his hands in his pockets. I've been struggling to find a reason for his resentment towards me, but I could come up with nothing. Maybe it's because I was young or something. Keep an eye on your neighbors. That old saying, a wolf in sheep's clothing, can really be more true than you realize. I do Uber Eats on the weekends, and sometimes on days when school is out. This happened just a couple of weeks before our school's holiday break. It was a Friday night, and I didn't have any plans at all. I figured, why not make a few extra bucks instead of being bored and laying around the house all day long? I started driving, set up the app to start getting orders. It wasn't really snowing out, but it was really cold and windy. There was still a thin layer of snow on the roads from earlier that day. I think it was around 6 p.m. or so when I started. I did a few orders before I got one to pick up from a nearby Burger King. Once I got the food, I checked on the app where I was going. It was clear at a first glance that this wasn't a real house address. When I zoomed in a little bit more, I was confused to see it was at the corner of two streets, looking like maybe a gas station. Although finding it to be unusual, I clicked begin route and started driving over. I didn't think it was anything bad. I just thought it was going to be an awkward interaction, since I'd probably have to find the person in the parking lot and give it to them directly. Usually, I'd never even see the customers. I just do a quick drop-off. As I got closer and drove up to the intersection it was at, I saw that it was indeed a gas station. That was right in the spot the directions were taking me to. The gas station itself looked normal, but there were no cars in the parking lot. I pulled in and parked in one of the spots at the back, then stayed in my car. I tried to look around for anyone. The app should have let them know that I'd arrived, so I was expecting someone to be out there waiting for me. Even after a couple of minutes, though, I didn't see anybody around here. I sent a text through the app just letting them know I was in the parking lot, waiting for them to come get their food. I got out of my car to see if I could get a better look around. The whole intersection was empty. No cars were passing by. All the stores on the street seemed to be closed for the night. The longer I stood out there, the more unsettled I became. I checked my phone, still seeing no response from the customer. I was just about to get back into my car when a truck pulled into the gas station. They passed the pumps and drove right up to me, parking just a couple of spots away. It was an older, dark red pickup with tinted windows. The first thought to come through my head was, why would they order a delivery if they were going to end up driving there anyway? I thought initially that maybe it was a worker at the gas station or somebody just hanging out here, but now this was way more suspicious than it already was. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out of the truck. From one look at him, I could see he had a very disheveled appearance, like someone you'd expect to see living out on the road. Even his clothes looked dirty, stained, and torn. As he got out, I held up the bag with a slight smile, but the man didn't even look at it. He kept his eyes locked on me. As he approached, something struck me, giving the feeling I needed to get out of there immediately. I set the bag on the ground. Almost immediately, the man started sprinting, as if he knew I was getting ready to leave. I got back in my car and started backing out, just as the man got up to my door. He ran back to his truck, leaving the bag of the food there on the ground. As I left the gas station, I saw him back out quickly and start speeding toward the exit I was leaving from. I floored it, going through a red light and speeding down the road until I got to where more cars were. The truck tried to follow me for a minute or so, but then turned away. Once I was safe, I called the police, but nothing really came of it. In the heat of the moment, I never even thought to check the man's license plate. Thinking back on it, I'm not even sure if he had one. I don't know what he was doing or what would have happened if I didn't leave when I did, but knowing I was that close to finding out is a horrifying thought. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is traveling and exploring the outdoors. I've been to many national parks and hiking trails over the past few years. Actually, I didn't really travel all that much until about 3 years ago. I changed jobs and suddenly had a lot more personal time to travel with the new one. Anyway, this story takes place a couple of years back, when I was still pretty new to the whole traveling thing. I had gone to a national park that I was really excited about. It wasn't all that popular, but it had some good hiking trails. Of course, I went there all by myself and started hiking in the morning. There were so many trails to explore in that park. After I did one of them, I went down to the local town. After hanging out there for a while and getting to know some of the locals, I got the itch to do some more hiking. I went back later in the afternoon, when the park was not so busy. It was large and spread out, so really it depended what trails and sections you went to. I went to a different spot this time. It was all kinds of terrain, hills, mountains, wooded areas. What I didn't know is that the trail I'd chosen was much longer and more complex than any of the other ones. I'm sure if I would have looked at the sign at the beginning, I would have realized it was a much more challenging affair, but I don't recall observing anything like that. I pretty much just went on the trail and started. There wasn't really anybody else on it. I also noticed that it was very quiet. I was really enjoying it starting out. Pretty soon, though, I was going farther and farther, and I realized it was starting to get pretty late. The sun would be setting in just about 30 minutes. I went in a little bit further, then decided to head back. There were multiple areas where the trail went in different directions, sometimes even splitting 3 or 4 ways. All the while, I had only seen a couple of people the entire time, and they were all near the beginning. I tried to go back, but soon I became very confused what direction I was even going in. I blamed this on the terrain. There were a lot of areas where you had to climb up or down rocks, kind of like stairs. I was trying to find my way back for about 30 minutes before it started to get really dark out. At that point, I realized I wasn't making any progress. I took out my phone, but it had no signal. I'd never really had a good signal the entire time I was in the park. I turned off my phone, then turned it on again. That didn't do anything. As I was walking back in what I thought might be the right direction, I soon began to hear something. It sounded like someone else was walking on the trail behind me. I turned around and saw a man right there. I stopped and waited for him to catch up. He was wearing black pants and a black shirt and had longer dark brown hair. He was also wearing a hat and sunglasses. I wasn't exactly sure where he'd come from, but I was glad to have someone there with me. I said hello to the man, and he said hello back to me. I told him I was lost and not sure of the way out. He said right away that he knew it. The man told me that he had hiked this trail many times before, and he knew the entire thing like the back of his hand. I described to him where I'd parked my vehicle, and he told me that he could lead me there. The man seemed perfectly friendly and normal. I felt much better after hearing that. The man told me to follow him, and we both started hiking back. After that point in time, he really didn't say anything to me. He started to go really fast, too. I didn't say much back to him either. I assumed he was going so fast because it was getting darker and darker out. We hiked for a good 20 minutes, and that's when I first began to question him. Even though I had gotten lost myself and was clearly not the best with directions, something about this just told me we were going the wrong way. One of the turns that he made I was for sure was completely wrong, but I didn't say anything. Who was I to criticize someone with more experience? I'd gotten myself lost in the first place. Thing is, 10 more minutes went by and we were only going deeper and deeper in. We passed by many places I was 100% sure I had not seen before. I was hoping to myself it was some kind of shortcut. Possibly any second we would turn out right near the entrance to the path, but that was not happening. I finally asked him how much further it would be. He claimed that it was not that much farther. Said for me to keep following him. After 5 more minutes, there was still no signs of anything. I wasn't sure if he was clueless or leading me the wrong way on purpose. We kept going, and I saw we were headed for a really dense patch of woods. Then he said it. "It's right over there, see?" I knew it was not there. There was no parking lot in sight, and the terrain was nothing like where I'd entered. I said that it didn't look like where I'd gone in, and asked him if there were multiple connecting parking lots or something. Maybe he'd gotten it confused for another one. The man said no, that was it. He was still walking in front of me at this point. He started to climb down a really steep area of rocks. I knew I needed to get away from him as soon as I could. As he started to make his way down, I acted like I was about to go too, then turned and ran in the opposite direction. As soon as I started sprinting down the trail away from him, I heard him immediately do a U-turn and begin climbing back up the rocks. The terrain would give me a pretty decent head start on him. I had no plan at all. I was just winging it. I felt danger, like the guy was leading me into the middle of the woods for a nefarious purpose. After running 50 feet, I stumbled upon some really tall grass and bushes. I crouched down and kept going through them. Eventually, I came out to a connecting trail, and I no longer heard the man behind me anymore. I slowed down and felt a bit better, but it was still dark out and I was still lost. I walked at a quick pace, trying to go more in the direction I thought was correct. I walked for about 20 minutes when I heard someone walking up ahead again. I saw the person, but thankfully I realized this time it was a park ranger. I approached him and asked if he knew how to get out. Of course he did. I followed the ranger, who was actually a very nice guy. I told him about the strange man I'd encountered before. He seemed very concerned about it. He said that guy had not been leading me near any exit at all. He had been leading me into the deepest parts. He radioed in and reported the incident. After we made it back to the parking lot, he said he would investigate it for me. After that, I left for the rest of the trip, and ever since then, I've been much more careful. It was the fall of 2018 when this happened to me. I was 22, and at the time I was living temporarily on the East Coast, right outside of the Appalachian mountain range. I'll go ahead and admit right now that I've never been too much of an outdoorsy person. I hadn't had any experience in camping, nor was I really interested in those sorts of activities anyway. However, this was my last year living in probably the best place to do all those outdoor things. Plus, with it being mid-fall, the environment looking so pretty, and the weather being so nice, I figured this was my one chance to try it out. Now, I didn't want to go on a huge camping adventure or anything. I simply found a simple hiking trail instead. It had some good views of the mountains, and I prepped a small backpack with some water, snacks, and a first aid kit. No cars were there when I arrived. It was just a small dirt parking area really, so I guess this wasn't really a popular trail. At least not as much as I thought it was. I parked and started walking down it. It was pretty calm, and it definitely didn't feel like a path a lot of people would take. It didn't have any noticeable recent shoe prints in the dirt, and it was a fairly small path. There were trees on either side, obscuring vision a bit. As I got further in, the entire path became more densely covered in trees, enough to even blot out the sun and make the whole trail look quite dark. It was actually pretty nice and cooling, but not hearing or seeing anyone else became a bit more unsettling the further out I got. Not exactly in a creepy way, but in an I'm all alone out here way. It wasn't something I was used to, not being around any other people. About an hour, or maybe even 2 hours down the trail, I was caught off guard by suddenly seeing a man up ahead of me. He was just sitting on the side of the path, looking like he was taking a break underneath a tree. As I passed him by, I gave him a friendly nod and said hello. He looked up at me but didn't say anything. He didn't smile or nod either. He just looked at me for a few seconds and I looked away. I wasn't sure what to make of that behavior. Maybe he didn't hear me, or maybe I'd caught him off guard as well. The strange look without even a slight smile, though, was not giving me a good feeling. I walked a bit faster for the next part of the trail, hoping to put some distance in between us. After an hour, I slowed down and made it to the end, which was an overlook of the mountains. The fall colors on the trees made the view way better than it would have been at any other time of the year. Overall, I was glad to have made the hike. I stared off into the distance for a few minutes, enjoying a view I would probably never get to see again. When I turned around, though, my heart just about leapt out of my body. I saw the man from earlier, standing right at the end of the trail. He was about 10 feet from me. I'd never even heard him walking behind me. After the initial scare, I realized how creepy it was that he was just standing there blocking the path, not coming out to look out the overlook like a normal person would be doing. He then did something even more odd. His face shifted as he gave a strained smile. "How's the view?" he asked. "Yeah, it's really nice. You should take a look too." I tried to be polite, but I was still more confused than anything. The man stepped closer, then pointed to my right. "There's an even better view down that trail, if you want to see." I looked over my shoulder to where he was pointing. There was a path that was barely visible, going through a patch of dense trees. It was rugged and undefined, not something that looked to be used very often. The man walked up to where the path started and stood at the entrance, telling me again about how great the view I would experience was, and saying it was just a minute or two walk into the woods to get there. I tried to decline, but he continued to insist how great it was. It became obvious he had other intentions than just wanting me to go there and see a nice view. I said I had to go home now, and started to walk toward the main trail. The man was quick to move his body to block it once more. I stopped in place, now even more terrified. I was thinking of the possible intentions of this man. He was just a few feet away from me, and we were stuck in the middle of an empty forest. The man looked at me with a 1,000-yard stare. I took a few steps walking around him and hoping he would not escalate the situation. For some miraculous reason, it didn't. The man simply let me go, and I made my way around him, back down the trail. Every time I looked back at him, he was watching me, not even trying to be discreet. Thankfully, he made no attempt to follow me. I made it back to my car just fine in the end. I don't know what that man was trying to do, but surely not anything good was down that path. Likely just a dead end. Somewhere for him to lead me before either killing me or doing something even worse, whatever horrible thing he had in mind. I don't know why he didn't try to stop me from leaving either. We were all alone there. Maybe he was worried about doing something on a main trail. All I can say is I'm lucky to have gotten out before he did something horrible to me. I remember this one time I found a phone on the side of the road. I was driving home later at night, around 10 p.m. or so. Things were pretty quiet as I came to a stop at a red light. I casually looked around the intersection that I was at. It was usually busy during the day, but at night it was pretty much a ghost town. I was next to a divider that was on my left, and that's when I noticed something on the ground. It appeared to be someone's phone. I opened my door and looked closer, realizing it was in fact a cell phone. I picked it up. It had been raining outside, so the phone was pretty wet. I figured it would probably be broken. After looking closer, I saw it was an iPhone of some sort. I hit the button, and to my surprise, it actually turned on. After that, the light turned green. I had to finish driving home, but once I was back, I took that phone out and looked it over. Nothing appeared to be wrong with it. I wanted to return it to the rightful owner. The phone was obviously password protected, so I had no clue who it belonged to. I tried the 1234 thing and some other obvious ones, but none of them seemed to work. After that, I tried to use voice commands. I asked Siri who the owner of the phone was. She said the phone belonged to someone named Brian. I had a name now, but unfortunately it was a pretty common name. I tried to ask for Brian's contact information to get a hold of him, but I was told the phone had to be unlocked for that. That was the same for everything else as well. I tried a lot of other commands, but wasn't getting any results. I only had this one name to go off of. After that, I decided to make a post on Craigslist. I put that I'd found somebody's cell phone. I described the area where I found it and included a picture of it as well. I asked the owner to get in touch with me. Within a day, I got a reply. The first reply was someone claiming the phone was theirs. I asked them what their name was. Obviously, if they answered with anything other than Brian, I knew it wasn't theirs. The first person didn't want to give me their name and asked me why I wanted to know. I said because I knew the name or the person the phone belonged to, and I wanted to make sure it was really them. They told me their name was Joe, and I knew they weren't the real owner. Sometime later, I got another reply, somebody just saying that it was their phone. When I asked them their name, they said Brian. This was promising. Perhaps I really had found the owner. I was happy and couldn't believe it actually worked. I asked Brian where he wanted to meet up to pick his phone up. He told me he didn't want to cause me any trouble, and he could just stop by my house. When he said that, I thought maybe I shouldn't give him my address. But I told myself, I'm not selling anything here, I'm just returning someone's belongings to their rightful owner. I convinced myself it was fine. I gave Brian my home address, and he told me he would stop by at 8 p.m. to grab the phone. I agreed, and that night around 8, there was a knock on my front door. I went over and answered it. Brian was out there, or at least that's who I assumed he was. He had sort of short reddish hair and was about average height. I said hello to him and handed him the phone. He took it and asked me where I'd found it. I told him exactly where. Oh yeah? That's crazy. He then just kind of stood there. I was about to say, have a good night and close the door, when randomly he asked me if he could come inside for a moment. I really didn't want him to. I knew nothing about this guy, and I certainly knew better than to let a random stranger into my home. Plus, I was the only one home at the time. I told him I was about to go to bed, and I started to shut the door. He just kept standing there looking at me. As I was about to close it, he said okay. I closed the door and locked it. Then I turned out the lights right inside. It didn't seem like Brian was walking away though. I went over to the living room window to look. When I did, I saw Brian just standing there on the front step, staring at my door. It was really weird. Probably 30 seconds later, he slowly walked back to his car that was parked on the side of the street. He got inside, and I was about to walk away. I wanted to make sure he'd left, though. I watched as he sat inside his car and didn't drive away. I kept watching. I wasn't going to leave until he did. For 20 minutes, he just sat inside his car. Then he got out again and started walking back up to my front step. I had a bad feeling now. I didn't know what he could possibly want from me. I was expecting him to maybe knock on the door or something, but he didn't do that. Instead, he stood on the front step and looked around for a few seconds, then started to walk away to the side of the house. When he was out of sight, I finally moved. I went to another window. I went to my bedroom. When I got to it, I just barely saw him go out of sight and behind my house. Now he was in my backyard. Well, I didn't like this at all. I moved to another back window and turned on a backlight outside. When it went on, I saw Brian continuing to walk through my backyard over to the other side of my house. Then he casually walked around the back to the front yard. Once he was there, he returned to his car, started the engine, and drove away. I was really weirded out by this. He had made a complete lap around my house. After he drove away, he didn't come back that night. At least, not that I'm aware of. I still wonder what exactly he was doing. My best guess is that he was going to try and break in, and when I turned the light on and he was sure I was observing him, it scared him off from attempting it. I really don't know. Either way, it was fairly unnerving. I was staying at an Airbnb in a neighboring city. This was over 3 years ago now, and although it wasn't completely necessary for me to rent an Airbnb for the night, I had a potentially important job interview in the morning and preferred not to drive 3 hours at dawn and immediately follow that up with an interview. I drove over at around 4 in the afternoon and arrived around 7 o'clock. The house was in a nice neighborhood, and it looked like any normal city street, with various family-sized homes and the like. I parked in the driveway and went inside, almost having my heart stop when a woman emerged from around the corner and introduced herself to me. I was not expecting to see anyone in the house, so I really had to collect myself before even responding. She said she was staying there for a few days in the other half of the home and thought to introduce herself to keep things from being awkward. I had no idea that this was supposed to be a shared rental, but I returned the favor and introduced myself as well. I went to my room and took my phone out of my pocket. I went to the Airbnb app to see if I'd made some kind of mistake, or if this was some kind of shady ripoff. Before I got the chance to really look at all, though, the woman came up to my door and started talking to me again. She asked a lot about me and was really trying to keep the small talk going. I tried to signal that I was not really interested in talking, but she didn't seem to notice or care. If I didn't know any better, I'd think she was trying to flirt with me or something. It was a little bit weird considering I'd just arrived there. It was pretty late in the day, so I was obviously tired. After a couple minutes, she went away, and I had the chance to check the app in full. Nowhere on it did it mention multiple rooms for rent. It just said it was the house itself. The pictures, however, did only show a single room, so it didn't really fully answer my question. I sent a text to the owner asking about it. I was already here, though, and didn't have the time or energy to make any other arrangements at that point. I was just hoping for a partial refund or something. After my bags were sorted in my room, I went to the kitchen to prepare some of the food I'd bought on the way. Less than a minute went by before the woman came out again and met me in the kitchen. It wasn't until now that I'd taken a better look at her. She was older, I'd say mid-40s. She had tired eyes and messy hair. It looked like she'd either just woken up or had been awake for far too long. She started up another conversation, asking me about myself and telling me about her. It became obvious now to me that she was trying to flirt with me or something. I was only in my early 20s, so this was pretty weird. I didn't want to be rude, especially if we'd be staying here together, but I got more and more weirded out as the conversation progressed. She started giving me the strange smile and asking me if I wanted to see her room. She was being really pushy about it. I insisted that she leave me alone so I could eat my food and go to bed. As I continued to deny her, her smile slowly diminished into a frown. She was starting to get upset at me. Just as the atmosphere was getting particularly creepy, my phone buzzed on the counter. I looked at it, and my stomach tightened. The owner sent me a text. Nobody else should be there. They told me to call the police right away if there was anybody inside. I looked back at the woman, who now had an angry look on her face. I heard a door open from down the hallway, followed by heavy footsteps charging through the home. I left everything and sprinted for the door. I saw a man in the corner of my eye running toward me as I left the property. I ran for my car, getting out of there as fast as I could. By the time the authorities arrived, the man and woman were nowhere to be found. What they would have done had I followed the woman into the room is unknown. Thankfully, and somewhat surprisingly, the belongings I'd left behind were still there. That only concerns me even more, though, about what their real intentions were. I'm a woman, and my name is Jessica. This occurred 2 years ago now. One day, I got a new text on my phone. It said, "Hey, is this Jessica?" I didn't know who it was, but it possibly could have been someone I knew. I responded by saying yes and asked whose number this was. The person said his name was JT, and that was it. Thing is, I didn't know any JTs. I tried to think of anybody I knew with those initials, but I couldn't think of anyone. I texted back, "Do I know you?" JT responded by asking if he could come over. I texted back this JT guy and asked him how he knew me once more. When I said that, he didn't respond. Needless to say, I was very confused by this whole thing. This guy clearly had the right number and knew who I was, but I had no clue who he could possibly be. I worked in the city and lived in a pretty populated area about 10 minutes away from there, but I saw lots of people on a daily basis. I was positive I did not know this guy. It was weird that he seemed to know exactly who I was. After he didn't answer his question as to how he knew me, it was even more suspicious. I blocked him right away. I didn't hear from him for the rest of the night. The next day, I got up and went to work as usual. Like I said, I worked in the city, so I would park my car in the street and walk over to the office. Everything was going normal for the workday. When it got to be an hour or so until I was off, though, I checked my phone. There was another new text on it from a different number. "Why did you block me?" Of course I knew who it was right away. It had to be this mysterious JT. I asked him why he kept texting me. He said he'd been trying to reach me and nothing was going through, so he realized he was blocked. He said he just wanted to talk to me. Then he said this, "I'm waiting for you at your car right now. I know you get off work soon." He was right, but how on earth did he know this? I had no clue. I blocked that number as well. I was hoping it was some sort of crazy joke or something, but I knew there was no way that was likely. When I got off work that day, I left the office and was very careful. What if this guy JT was actually waiting for me at my car? I walked back to my vehicle, which took a few minutes. I got within view of it, but was still a long ways away. I could see there really was a man standing nearby on the sidewalk. I stopped where I was and kept watching him. I was trying to determine whether this was just some random guy or if it was that JT guy. He wasn't walking away and was looking around all over. I didn't recognize him at all. When he looked over in my direction, he made eye contact with me. I looked away. I saw him start walking over to me immediately. He was a long ways away, but I knew I needed to get out of there right now. I started walking down the sidewalk in the opposite direction, as quickly as I could. I made it a few blocks and saw a grocery store. I ran inside, hoping JT hadn't seen me go in. There were a decent amount of people out walking on the sidewalks and stuff, so there was a good chance he hadn't realized I'd gone in there. I walked around the grocery store for a few minutes, looking around because I wasn't really sure what to do. I was hoping not to see JT anywhere. I noticed a police officer who just happened to be in the grocery store. I approached the officer and told him of my situation. He said he could walk to my car with me and see if this JT was still out there. We left the grocery store and I kept my eyes out for JT, but we didn't see him at all. Thankfully, I made it back to my car safely and was then able to drive home. I was glad I'd made it back. However, JT had gotten away. He still knew where I worked and my schedule. I just hoped that he didn't know where I lived now. I lived in an apartment up on the 5th floor during this time. It was a pretty typical one-bedroom place. That night, I felt incredibly unsettled when about 10 p.m. there was a knock on my door. I knew who it had to be right away. It must be JT. I instantly grabbed my phone and called the police. I didn't even bother to look out the peephole or anything. I was that confident it was him. A few minutes later, he knocked on the door again. I didn't answer. I got another text on my phone from yet another new number. "Open the door. I know you're home." I didn't reply. I just hoped the police would get there soon. 10 minutes went by. I was in my bedroom hiding and listening for any sounds. JT was not knocking anymore. I figured he might have left, but suddenly I heard some voices from the hallway. I realized the police must have arrived. I went to the door and looked out, and sure enough, JT was still there. He was talking to them. They got him to go away, and I also got a restraining order against him. Thankfully, after that night, I haven't seen him since, and I also haven't received any more texts from him. Back in 2014, I moved to a beautiful town in the northeastern United States. It was just quiet enough for me, and I couldn't wait to start my new life there. I just started seeing someone a few weeks prior to this happening, but we weren't living together at the time of this story. I was alone most nights, which I didn't mind at the time. When I started seeing this new girlfriend, she made it clear to me that we couldn't sit in old stone-cold Steve Austin furniture anymore, and I needed to find some real furniture. I hate to say it, but she was right. I found a lot of stuff at the thrift store, but garage sales were where I was really furnishing my entire house from. Lamps, tables, couches, you name it. I was buying one. Saturday afternoon, when I was looking for some kitchen stuff, I met this one guy who was selling some really cool things. It wasn't your typical garage sale junk he had. He had these weird statues and relics from different religions, it looked like. He told me that he and his son used to collect artifacts from all over the world. They were fascinated by different cultures and ideas. I was truly interested in these stories. He went on to tell me that his son had taken a job in Japan, and he wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. His son had said it was okay to sell all the stuff, since it was probably worthless either way. The stuff was awesome though, and I was totally willing to buy some of this junk for cheap. I'm a collector of weird oddities myself. So, to be able to get more weird stuff to throw on my bookshelf was an opportunity I could not pass up. I grabbed some rocks from some ancient city I forgot the name of, and some ancient Babylonian statues. The guy assured me they were all replicas, but my guests don't need to know that when they come over. He was laying out some more relics when some random old woman came over and flipped the table over. She started to claim that the symbols on one of the rocks were cursed and against her religion. I told her to relax. These weren't even real. She was not having it though. She was probably 75 years old. She started going crazy and began crying as well. I gestured to the guy to put the stuff away, and I would come back later to take a look. That's exactly what I did, but in the meantime I walked the woman to her car and made sure she was alright. I even apologized for buying the allegedly cursed items. I lied to her and just told her I returned them. I ended up spending almost $70, but I bought almost all the weird relics and occult items this guy had. When I got home, I decorated my house with them. I was pleased and quite happy with my day of garage sale hunting. I was talking to my girlfriend that night on the phone. She was quite happy for me, but also gave me a piece of her mind about buying random junk I didn't need. It was sort of a problem with me. Again, she was right, and we ended up talking on the phone for a long time that night. Before I knew it, it was already after midnight. I was ready to head to bed. We were still on the phone as I was climbing in, when I heard the sound of a door shutting inside my home. Without hanging up, I told her I was going to go check it out, even though she told me not to and to be careful. I was sure it was probably just the wind or air pressure slamming the basement door or something. That hadn't really happened before, but I guessed it could have been the first time. I remember while I was walking down the upstairs hallway, my girlfriend was really convinced these items were actually cursed. I remember specifically laughing out loud at that. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, though, I heard a voice coming from around the corner. While on the phone with my girlfriend, I texted her and said to call 911. I heard the voice coming from my living room. It was soft and gentle, clearly an older woman's voice. She just kept muttering no over and over. I instantly remembered the old woman from the garage sale earlier that day. There's no way, I thought to myself. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek around the corner, and I couldn't believe my eyes. The woman was kneeling down in front of my bookcase, rocking back and forth while whispering no over and over. I didn't engage with her. I figured I should let the police deal with this situation. I just hoped they would show up soon enough. Thankfully, the police showed up in about 2 minutes. They came up and, in a very calm and professional way, they apprehended the woman. She immediately became erratic, claiming my house was cursed, and she had to exorcise us. I thanked her, but trust me when I tell you I had those cops take her out of my house right away. I found out after the fact that the woman was obviously not mentally all there. She was diagnosed with some laundry list worth of things. The fact that she was still out there is what's truly horrifying. It's also a bit sad. She didn't have any family or friends to rein her in. Apparently, this poor woman was alone in the world. I don't know what happened to her after this. It wouldn't surprise me one bit if she's still alive and kicking. I'm thankful my girlfriend called the police, because I don't know what would have happened if she didn't. It's not the most important detail, but I think it's worth noting that my girlfriend in this story is now my wife. Still to this day, I have all the weird statues and stuff all over my house. So if they really are cursed, I'm waiting for that bad luck to come anytime. About 5 years ago, my wife and I took a trip to Colorado. I don't know how she always does it, but she found this awesome place for us to camp out at. Whenever I try to find any destination for us, I always fail miserably. It's one of the many reasons why I love her so much. She always has a plan and keeps me on the right track. That's pretty great since I'm the most indecisive person I know. Basically, we had free rein to camp wherever we wanted in this area. I drove our truck to the perfect spot, and then we started setting up our tent, grill, and everything else. We were planning on staying 5 nights. Unfortunately, we only made it 3 though. I'm sure you would have left too, if you experienced what we had experienced on that 3rd night. The first few days were pretty great. Unlike a lot of camping destinations in the United States, this part of the country was different. Maybe it's just me because I grew up on the East Coast, but when I think of camping, I think trees, lakes, slasher movies from the 80s. Instead, this area was filled with mountains, sand, and an entirely different type of vegetation than I was used to. I fell in love instantly with the area we were in. I made sure I was living every day to the fullest. Probably the best part of this specific trip, though, was the fact that there was nobody else there. In the 3 days, we hadn't seen one person in there. That may seem creepy to some people, but for us, that was perfect. Then the dreaded 3rd night came. The day had been awesome, just like all the previous days. We hiked some mountain trails and were more than a bit exhausted than we had been. We took it easy that night and climbed into our tent early. I think the last time I looked at the clock was around 9 p.m. or so. Not long after that, I fell asleep, and my wife did as well. I woke up several hours later, though, to my wife shaking me vigorously. I asked her what was going on. She held a finger up to her lips, gesturing to be quiet, and pointing outside the tent. I didn't know what was going on. I was being quiet, but I didn't know what I was supposed to be listening to. She eventually sort of mouthed the words to me, "I think there might be an animal out there." I laughed because I remember thinking it was cute she was afraid of an animal. In hindsight, that was very stupid of me. There are a number of animals in the area that could have easily ripped us to shreds if they wanted to. I began listening in closer, since I hadn't heard anything right away. I then heard a growl. It was the strangest growl I'd ever heard in my life. I'm not some animal expert or anything, but it was strange. It didn't feel like the sound of a bear growling or something like that. It was more like a weak attempt at a growl, I thought maybe some dying animal was out there. I started to remember this article I read about a coyote with rabies or something that went crazy and attacked a bunch of people. The footsteps of whatever was outside the tent sounded light, so whatever this creature was, it was small. I didn't want to take any chances with a beast outside. When I heard the creature make some distance away from the tent, I unzipped it and told my wife to get in the truck. Once the zipper was fully unzipped, we didn't see anything outside. We both quickly jogged over and unlocked the doors. We dove in. Once we were inside, we looked out the tinted windows, trying to get a glimpse of whatever creature had been making that noise. A few minutes passed and we didn't see anything, no movement whatsoever. I knew that something had been out there. Not only did I hear the footsteps, but we'd both heard the strange growling quite clearly. My wife had just started to fall asleep again, when this time I jolted her awake. I screamed, because what I saw was no creature at all. It was in fact a human being. It was a wild-looking man, with long hair and a beard down to his chest. He was walking hunched over, making these strange growling noises that we'd heard before. I was about ready to jump out of the truck and confront this guy. That was when the nightmare got even worse. Just beyond where we had our tent set up, 3 more men walked into our camp area. It looked like they were whispering and laughing to one another. 3 of the 4 guys were carrying these large sticks. One of the guys, without any notice, pulled the stick all the way back behind his head and swung the stick down on top of our empty tent. I heard one guy yell something, which made me think this guy must have thought we were still in there. Fight or flight mode kicked in immediately. I started the truck and drove off as fast as I could, leaving the tent and all those creeps in the dust. I didn't even look back to see his facial expression or anything. I just drove as fast as I could, and as far away as I could. While we were driving, my wife waited until we got service and called the police. She told them what happened. I think she was put in touch with the park ranger or someone like that, because some type of law enforcement called her phone a few times. We never went back for the tent or any of our other stuff, which was just fine with us. The park ended up charging some sort of fee for leaving all our stuff there, and technically canceling the reservation early. Law enforcement was sympathetic, but the people who operated the camp itself didn't care at all. They still charged us the full fees, claiming it was policy. At the end of the day, though, it was a small price to pay for the luxury of continuing my life unharmed. I sincerely hope that whoever those monsters were, they were caught and are incapable of trying to cause anyone else harm. I've worked for loads of different builders firms over the years. At one point, I was working as what was basically a supervisor for a small but very successful local firm. It was a hard graft and the boss could be a proper wanker sometimes, but the pay was out of this world. We'd contract these killer jobs, but because no one else wanted them or could get them done on time, the firm could basically name their price. Pay varied from job to job, and some seemed less worth it than others, but it was way more than I'd be getting from other firms in the area. I was pretty chuffed about that. The only problem was, it wasn't the most stable of jobs, because if there was nothing available, there was no work. One day, our problems were solved. There was some housing development being laid out about halfway between us, in the next big town over. The local council had already hired a national firm to do the job, but apparently there was some miscommunication about the project finish date, and the big firm had pulled out. This left the council completely in the lurch, as they had already signed the contract on the demolition of some of the older housing estates. Basically, if these blocks didn't get built, a whole lot of people were going to be homeless. And that's where we stepped in. According to the head of the firm, we could get the job done under budget and ahead of schedule. Our secret weapon was night shifts. If the shifts were staggered between all the lads that worked there, we could have one group work during the day and one during the night, and get the whole job done in just a few months. All we had to do was throw down the foundations and brickwork, and then another firm was coming in for the decorating. They all needed to be done by a set date. You get the idea. Anyway, we started the job. We were all just doing a week of days followed by a week of nights, then alternating with the other half of the firm. The days were alright, but the nights got very difficult very quickly. As anyone who's done any serious night shifts will tell you, your daytime life doesn't stop. Those with kids had to go get them to school and back, or there'd be doctor's appointments or other things like that to get done. A group might start a week of nights all chipper and up for it, but by the time Saturday morning came around, they were about ready to drop dead where they stood. This got worse and worse over the weeks and months, with everyone complaining about being overtired. We didn't want to just throw in the towel and risk breaking the deadline, though. That would have put the whole contract at risk. Lads were joking about some kind of accident happening, but we all kept our heads screwed on, kept ourselves from cutting corners, and otherwise kept ourselves safe on the job. That couldn't be said for everyone on the site, though, and in the end, I suppose it was a case of the inevitable finally happening. We had this massive 500-ton mobile crane on site, brand spanking new, on lease. It was one experienced bloke and one apprentice operating it. One night, the crane was in use shifting some steel panels around, when for some reason, the apprentice decided to get one of his later jobs done earlier. He probably thought it was in a safe spot, considering the crane was operating on the opposite side of him. He made a massive error of judgment, though. He didn't realize it until way too late. He didn't think he was in what you might call the crane's swinging area. Suddenly, a bunch of blokes needed a box of plates from another area of the site. The crane turned the other way to grab it. And that was that. All I heard was a load of shouting. At first, really frantic, frightened-sounding shouts, too. I knew immediately something had gone badly wrong. I ran over to find the apprentice had gotten trapped between the crane's massive counterweights and the deck he was cleaning. It crushed him so badly his body disintegrated when the counterweights were pulled away. I suppose if every bone in your body had been smashed to bits, there would be not much left to hold a person together. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen in my life. Honestly, it was horrible. I'll never forget that sight. I'm an absolute bastard when it comes to health and safety now. I'm like a bloody drill sergeant. Some of the younger lads might think I'm just being a prick, but I'd rather be a prick whose apprentices go home to their moms and dads than a nice bloke at their bloody funerals. The whole aftermath was grim as well. The family of the lad tried to take the firm to court, trying to get a load of money out of them, but the firm was quite easily able to prove that the lad was doing something he knew he shouldn't have been. You gotta sign all sorts of paperwork saying you understood what you'd been told in terms of workplace safety. So if you breach any of it on purpose and get hurt in the process, you haven't got a legal leg to stand on. It was just heartbreaking, really. To be honest, I don't even think the family were in it for the money. They just needed someone to blame. When you're in that period of mourning, you don't want to accept it was your loved one's own fault they lost their life. It's just too soon to have that in your head. The head of the firm lost a lot of sleep over it, actually. He thought to himself, could I have stopped that in any way, either through more training or holding the apprentices to a higher standard before taking them on? It was horrible for everyone involved. It was especially horrible for all the lads who had to see what was left over of the poor guy after the accident. They had their fair share of sleepless nights, and I do too. Ask anyone working in fast food if it's something they enjoy. The answer will always be no. The reasons might not be as concerning as mine are, but the opinion is usually the same. I was 20 years old and had just gotten a job at a local fast food place that wasn't one of those chain restaurants. That also meant it wasn't exactly run very well. Only on my third day, I was left alone after 8 p.m. to close the restaurant by myself. I didn't like the feeling of being there alone. It was a pretty small town though, and there were only 3 hours left to my shift. I was just waiting at the counter for someone to come in and order something. But no one came in for at least an hour after being there alone. I heard the door eventually open, and the bell that was hanging on the handle started to ding. I looked up from my phone, and my heart just dropped immediately. Standing only a few feet away from me was a very large, very disheveled-seeming homeless man. Now don't judge me for being scared. Most young women would be scared of the presence of any giant guy alone, let alone one who looked like he'd been living on the streets for half a decade. I was, of course, still very polite to him. He walked up to the counter, and I had to hold off from gagging from the smell radiating off this guy's body. He was very soft-spoken, which eased my nerves a little bit, but I still felt uneasy about the situation. He ordered a burger and some fries, and I got to making it right away. As I walked a couple of steps back into the kitchen, though, he must have taken note that I hadn't called out the order for anyone else to make it. "Are you here alone tonight, sweetie?" My whole body lit up with chills. I told him that of course I was not there alone. My coworkers were just having a smoke break out back. He obviously didn't buy it, though. "Don't lie to me, darling. There's nobody back there." I started to get extremely uncomfortable. I wanted nothing more than for this man to go away and leave me alone. Unfortunately, I already knew that wasn't going to be happening anytime soon. Thankfully, just as the man began approaching the counter again, a woman and her 2 kids walked in. He saw them and stepped back and sat down at a table. It had direct line of sight into the kitchen. I guess he wanted to make sure he could see me at all times. Let me tell you, feeling his eyes constantly on me did not feel good. Although I was thoroughly creeped out, he hadn't done anything wrong yet, so I couldn't ask him to leave. The woman ordered some food for herself and her children. I was praying the whole time she'd get it for dine-in. But I guess I just couldn't be that lucky. She got it as takeout. I know it wasn't the best thing to do, but I spent as long as humanly possible making her food. I finished the man's first and called his name to pick up from the counter. He rushed over and did something so gross. I can't really tell you the reason why. Just as I was setting his tray down on the counter, he leaned over and breathed heavily in my face. This time I couldn't suppress the gag. In fact, I started dry heaving. The man didn't take offense though. He actually smirked at me, like he was happy about me gagging. The woman asked if I was okay, and I told her I was fine. I didn't want her to leave, but there was nothing I could really do to get her to stay either. I got her food backed up and called out her name. She was out the door and gone. "Alone again, aren't we?" I backed away from the counter when I noticed the man approaching again. He had this wide, creepy smile, and I hated every second of it. His teeth were yellow and chipped, and I didn't really want to experience that smell again. I backed away as he leaned over the counter and stared at me. That's when I finally built up the courage to tell him to leave. "We're actually going to be closing the restaurant early tonight, so if you don't mind, collect your belongings and exit. That would be great." I really tried to sound as nice and calm as possible. I didn't want to show any fear and make myself seem vulnerable in any way. To my surprise, he actually did leave. I watched out the window as he walked down the street and into the dark out of sight. I was able to breathe a sigh of relief. I went back into the office and grabbed the keys. I practically ran to the front door and locked it. I was so happy that I was locked in and no one could get to me. I didn't care if I got fired. I was closing and going home, where I knew I'd be safe. I was wiping down the cutting boards and singing a song to myself when I suddenly heard a crashing sound from the lobby, like one of the windows had just been shattered. I had an idea of what just happened, but I wasn't about to go and look. I just had this horrible feeling in my gut that the man had come back for me, and I had to hide right now. I had this thing where every time I entered a building, I would always come up with an escape plan first, if I needed to. This restaurant wasn't any different. I wasn't going at the back exit, just in case someone was there waiting for me. I went to the one place I knew I could hide where no one would find me. I grabbed my puffy jacket and went inside the walk-in freezer. I shut the door behind me, and as quietly as I could, I huddled in the back corner. There was a small space next to the roll-away metal shelving that I could just barely squeeze into. The boxes of burger patties and frozen fries covered most of where I was hiding. I was crouched down to the point that I was holding my legs tight against my body. I planned to stay there like that until I knew it was safe to leave. I could hear something outside the freezer door and things being moved around. I was in there for about 20 minutes. I hoped the ordeal would be over soon. I was literally shaking from fear and cold. I was grateful, though, that whoever was out there hadn't thought to look for me in the freezer yet. That gratitude wouldn't last, though. I sucked in a deep breath as I heard the walk-in door open. I peered through the shelves and saw the same boots and pants that homeless man had been wearing. I held my breath and did everything I could not to make any noise at all. My heart was racing so fast that I was literally holding back tears. I felt like I was going to pass out. "Baby girl, are you in here? Daddy just wants to talk to you. I know you need a nice cuddle." His voice was no longer soft, but loud and desperate. I wish I could explain the horror I felt in that moment. No words would be able to describe it, though. I let out the breath I was holding in and prayed to God he wouldn't hear it. Thankfully, he did not. He exited the walk-in and left the door open, letting some of the coldness out with it. I heard the sound of glass cracking and figured that meant he was crawling back out through the window he had broken to get in. It didn't matter to me, though. I had no plans to leave that spot until I knew for sure I wasn't in any more danger. Before anyone asks why I didn't call the police, by the way, this was at a time before cell phones, and I wasn't about to get up and go use the landline. Eventually, the walk-in stopped being so cold, and I ended up even falling asleep in that position. I woke up to the sound of people talking only feet from where I was still hiding. I looked through the shelves and was happy to see my manager and a police officer standing there over me. By that time, my legs had gone completely numb, and I couldn't move them at all. All I could do was call out for help. They were shocked to see me back there, and did help me get out. The officer sat me down in the lobby, and I told him everything. He promised that they'd keep an eye out for the man that I described, but he couldn't make any promises about catching him. I quit that job right then and there, and haven't stepped foot in that building ever since. Thank God I never saw that man again, which I was grateful for. I was also disappointed, though, that the police never even really seemed to make an attempt to find him. I eventually ended up going to therapy for a while because I stopped sleeping and eating from the trauma of that experience. I don't like thinking about it, but telling others the story has given me a weird sense of closure. My one piece of advice to anyone listening is to always have an exit strategy wherever you go, or at least a really good place to hide. A lot of people hate the city, but I would rather take the city over the wilderness any day of the week, especially after what happened to me and my friends a year ago. My one friend had just separated from her fiancé, who she had been with for about 7 years now. She was not doing super great with the breakup, which of course I don't blame her for at all. Her other friend, who is the outdoorsy type, suggested we all go away for a night and just camp out in the woods together. Surprisingly, she was into the idea. So the three of us found this cute little cottage in the middle of the woods to camp out in for a night. I was excited to have a night out with my girls. That wasn't in the city or about getting all dolled up and all that jazz. Of course, once we got there though, my one recently separated friend got quite bored. I knew that was going to happen. She started looking up local bars in the area and eventually found this dive bar in a nearby town. Now that was my idea of camping. At least that's what I joked about with my friends. It was a nice change of pace though. We went on down to the local bar, and it was nice to not have to worry about the city scene. While we were at this place, it appeared to be just a handful of locals at the bar, and that's pretty much it, as far as I could tell at least. My friend started up a conversation with one of the guys. He was a middle-aged man who was very handsome, in a rugged sort of way. I don't know if it was the alcohol or just the feeling of being depressed, but whatever it was, she was flirting very heavily with this man. It went on for a while, but eventually she separated from him and told us she was ready to head back to the cottage with us. On the way back, we were giving her a hard time and teasing her about her bar friend. She just laughed it off, claiming it wasn't that big of a deal. When we got back to the cottage, we all had a glass of wine before we decided to go off to bed for the evening. It was clear at this point that camping was really not for us. We hated being in this little cottage with no Wi-Fi and nothing to really do. I knew our one outdoorsy friend meant well by setting this whole thing up, but it wasn't a good time for the rest of us. We all decided to sleep in the living room together. One of us on the couch, one of us on the love seat, and one of us in the recliner. It didn't take long for all of us to go to sleep. A little after 3 in the morning, though, I was nudged awake by one of my friends, who looked very concerned. She told me she had heard the doorknob kind of jiggling. I laughed at her and told her she was just imagining things, and that's when I began to hear it too. The doorknob really was shaking, and not just a little bit either. Whoever was out there was really trying to get inside. We were too scared to get up, so we just cuddled up together on the couch and held the blanket up to our faces. Since the cottage was so small, you could walk from the front door around the entire building in no time at all, and to our horror, that's exactly what the person outside did. We listened to each step outside, as they were clearly sneaking around. We could make out every little twig snapping after each step. The person made their way around to the back of the cottage, which was behind the couch we were laying on. There was a large window at the back. The person went over to that window, and we started to hear shuffling on the other side of the curtain. It occurred to us that the person was trying to pull it open. I don't know what got into me, but I decided to yell that I was calling the police. The noise stopped for just a moment, and then a whisper could be heard from the other side of the window. It seemed to be a man's voice. He was whispering the name of my friend, the same friend who had been flirting with that man at the bar. My mind went to that guy right away. I refused to believe that he had followed us here, but there was no other way that he'd know we were at this house. I whipped open the curtain, and like a deer caught in the headlights, the man just stood there. It was, in fact, that exact same guy from the bar. He put his hands up in a sort of defensive position, and then just ran away. He didn't get into a car, at least none that I saw. We phoned the police right away, and reported what could have been a potential home invasion. I'm not sure anything ever came of it though, since we left first thing in the morning, which wasn't that long after the cops. It wasn't until the drive home that we really got ourselves worked up and scared. And that's when we started to piece together everything. We got back to the cottage before midnight, and the guy didn't bother trying to break in until after 3 in the morning. That means he had to have followed us to know where we were staying and waited for us to fall asleep for 3 hours. Only then did he try to get in. The thought of this man lurking outside for all those hours makes me want to throw up. I'm so thankful my friend woke up to the doorknob noise, because if she didn't, I don't know what would have happened to us. We found out after the fact the window had been unlocked, and it would have only been a matter of time before he would have gotten in. In a sick way, this trip really did help my friend because she was so thankful to escape unharmed that she was able to put her life into perspective and start the long road of healing after a horrible breakup. This story took place a few years ago now. I know looking back that this situation could have been handled better on my part. I feel sort of dumb even telling it, but I want other people to hear it so they can learn from my mistakes. I was 19 years old and was at my parents' house. My older sister and her boyfriend were staying over. We lived in a very populated neighborhood. There were lots of houses on my street, and many on other streets nearby as well. Our house was sort of at the end, and probably the biggest one. We were hanging out one night. Our plan was to get some pizza. My mom made the order, and I offered to go pick it up for her. I had recently gotten myself a new car, and I really enjoyed driving it whenever I could. I knew that we could have had the pizza just be delivered, but we would always just go get it at the pizza place anyway. It was just a little over 5 minutes away, so it wasn't a big deal. Plus, we could save some money on the tip. I left the house at sometime after 7 p.m. or so. The sun had already set, and it was pretty dark out by now. I went out to my car and was parked at the top of our driveway. I backed out and into the street. As soon as I finished backing out, I noticed a car parked on the side of our street with its headlights on. A little ways back, there were not a lot of cars parked on the side of the street typically, but it was also not super uncommon. When I started driving away though, what was uncommon was for the car to start immediately driving behind me. I approached the stop sign at the end of our street, and when I reached it, the car was right on my tail. I turned and so did this car. It was the really close following distance that really made me nervous about this guy though. I was just driving the normal way to the pizza place, but this car was right up on my bumper. I continued down the street a little ways, and at the next turn, once again the car followed behind me. And that's when I went from just thinking this was an overly aggressive driver to someone who was deliberately following me. I had no clue why someone would want to follow me though. I turned again and sort of pulled over to the side of the road. I wanted the car to go around me. Instead, they just pulled over right behind me. I really started to panic. I had no clue what to do. I got out my phone and called my mom. When she answered, I told her I was being followed, and I wasn't sure what to do. As I was talking, I pulled out and started making random turns. The car followed right behind me. I was trying to lose them, but I was not able to do so. My mom told me to come back home, and if the car was still following me when I got back, she would call the police. I kept driving, now headed back for home. It took about 5 minutes or so. The car was behind me the entire time. When I got back to our street, I pulled into the driveway. The car did not pull in after me. Instead, it drove a little ways down the road and parked in the exact same spot it had been before. After I parked my car, I got out and sprinted for the front door. I got back inside and showed my parents from the window where the car was. It was still just parked right there. We couldn't quite see the license plate from our distance, but we called the police anyway. About 5 minutes later, the car drove away. When the police got there a little while after it had already left, I talked to them and told them my story. We were all very disappointed the car had gotten away. After the police left, I was nervous it would come back. After that, though, I never did see it again. Looking back, I should have just drove to a police station while the car was following me. I could have called the police in advance as well. I probably shouldn't have just gone back home, but I guess the car already knew where I lived anyway. I'm still not exactly sure what was going on there, though, or why this guy followed me. I worked for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department for 8 years, and in that time I only ever had to draw my sidearm once. A lot of other cops might tell you that's kind of miraculous, and I should consider myself lucky. I do, in a manner of speaking. Those same cops, though, might also admit that my one drawing of my firearm was worth 3 or 4 of their own, purely on sheer circumstance alone. I was driving through North Vegas one night after getting a call to the 7-Eleven on East Owens Avenue. On my way back towards the Strip, I was slowing down as I came upon some lights. And that's when I spotted something weird on James Street to my right. There was a car parked on the sidewalk with all the lights inside the car switched on. It looked like the driver was slumped over in an unnatural position. I didn't have any other calls, so I figured I'd drive around the block and roll past them real slow, just to see if this guy was okay. Lo and behold, there was a guy passed out in the driver's seat of his car. After a quick look around the driver and passenger side to check for weapons, I knocked on the guy's window a few times to wake him up. The guy looked maybe to be in his late 30s or so, Hispanic with a closely cropped haircut. He was wearing what looked like work gear. When I knocked on his window, he woke up startled. The first words out of his mouth were, "Oh my God, officer, I'm so sorry. This is literally my house right here." I nodded off after I parked here. I asked him where he'd come from, and he told me he worked nights at the chemical plant over in Henderson. He'd spent all day doing something for his family and had to work right after, so after running on almost 24 hours of no sleep, he just passed out of sheer exhaustion. Normally, I'd perform a field sobriety check on this guy or something, but he genuinely did seem to be exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot and his speech was groggy. He didn't smell like booze and his ID checked out. There was something that didn't sit right with me, though. I asked him which chemical plant he worked for. He said something like Olin chloralkali, but I had a cousin in the chemical industry, and he worked in the same industrial park. There was only one single company there named Borman Company, and if he didn't work there, he wouldn't have been working on anything. I ran his ID, and the guy didn't seem to have any criminal past. It was nothing but a few late parking fines. I figured just to be certain, I'd run a field sobriety test. In the worst case scenario, I'd minorly inconvenience this dude and he'd just go into his house and understand my reasons for doing so, given how suspicious he was being. The other scenario was I'd find out what was making my spidey senses tingle about this guy. It was a small lie to catch the guy in, but when that happens, you have to ask yourself, well, why is that guy lying about this thing if it's no big deal? I headed back over and asked if he'd mind undergoing a sobriety check. He said, "No, not at all, sir." There was an awkward pause before he said, "Do you want me to do it now?" I nodded and he looked back at me, as if to say, "Really? I thought we were cool." I promised to make it fast as possible so that if he really did live in this building, he could just go inside and go to bed, but I didn't want to risk letting a dangerous driver go. As this all happened, the guy's arm, which had been resting on the door where he'd rolled down the window, disappeared behind it to where I couldn't see. I took a quick step toward the guy and told him very politely to keep his hands where I could see them. He threw them both up and said, Okay, chill out." They started drooping down again, though. He kept telling me it was okay, he didn't have any weapons in the car, he was just trying to unlock the door. I told him to unlock the door with his other hand then. In a split second it happened. He grabbed a gun tucked behind his back on the driver's seat. I was so focused on his left arm that I'd figured he was just reaching down for leverage. He pushed himself forward and started shooting at me. One of the bullets went straight through my arm. My gun was in my right hand, though. I dropped back out of his arc of fire and started firing back. I put bullets into the driver's seat and into the man's center of mass. My left arm started to go numb and stopped working on me, so I had to grab my radio with my right hand and call it in. It was a swift firefight. A few well-placed shots though, and the man was in no position to fire back anymore. I was scared out of my mind. I didn't want to shoot the guy again, but disarming or detaining him at this point was out of the question, especially thanks to the fact that my left arm was no longer working anymore. I remember I stopped barking commands at him for a second, only to hear the guy weakly say something like, "Why'd you shoot me, man? I'm outside my house." He said it like he hadn't just pulled a gun and started shooting at me first, like I'd just shot him for being asleep in his car or something. That happens way more often than you'd think, too. I remember I once watched a woman flee a traffic stop, crash her car into a family's SUV, and try to stab the officer who pulled her out of the wreck of the car. Then she just laid there saying she didn't do anything. I guess some people get real scared when they think they're going to jail, be it first-timers or serious offenders. Sometimes they choose death over giving up whatever they've got going on. For example, the guy who blew up my left arm. With the way he pulled out his gun and started firing with no issue, you'd think he was a cartel member with hundreds of warrants out for him. But no, this was a guy who'd never been in trouble with the law before. He just couldn't face going without the oxys he was hooked on. That's what my officers found in the car. A bottle of oxys with no prescription. Now, with no priors and a good attorney, he could have easily gotten himself a suspended sentence and counseling at the worst. Maybe 6 months of probation with good behavior. But the thought of him having to detox in jail made him do something he couldn't come back from. I guess some people really do think that's a fate worse than death. This freaky story happened to me a few years back, when my wife was still my girlfriend. We decided to make an impromptu camping trip. I'd never camped much, other than a few times with a friend of mine. My girlfriend used to camp all the time with her family when she was younger though, and she really wanted to do it again. She thought it would be a great chance for she and I to spend some time together, away from all the noise of the city that she and I lived in at the time. She went all out and bought a bunch of awesome camping stuff. Amongst the items she bought was a nice new tent. It was a bigger tent, especially for 2 people, but I never minded more room. That was always okay with me since I was a bigger guy. At the time of this story, one thing I really liked about this tent, which I found out later on that most tents actually have, was that it had a little window thing on it, so you could see what was outside. At night, I knew it was going to be dark, but just the ability to be able to see and have the light shine in on us in the morning was a comforting thought for me. We arrived at the desolate camping location in the afternoon. We were only staying 2 nights, so we wanted to make the best of the trip. That first afternoon, we didn't really do much, just kind of chilled, set up the tent, and went to bed early. I was loving my little window. I was able to stare around outside with it while I was laying in my sleeping bag, and because of where the tent was located, I was able to see a good view of the night sky. It was beautiful. Just as I expected, the light blasted through the window in the morning. It was almost like waking up in my own bed. We got out of bed early that day, and really made the most of it. We went fishing, hiking. We were also able to spend a considerable amount of time laying around relaxing and enjoying each other's company. We were on track to having another early night. I was alright with that though. Neither one of us has ever been a night owl. We were beat from everything we'd done earlier in the day. We got all cozy in the tent, and I made sure I propped my window screen open. While I was starting to drift off, I thought I'd noticed something outside. It kind of looked like movement, but I didn't know if I'd dozed off for a second or if I was really seeing something out there. I sat up, and before I could get a good look, my girlfriend said, "Did you see that too?" I told her I thought I'd seen something, but I wasn't sure. We both stared out our little tent window. It just looked like a peaceful night. My girlfriend gasped. It sounded like air had been sucked out of her. To this day, I've never seen the expression she had in that moment. Sitting on a tree branch about 30 to 40 feet away was a person. They were wearing one of those weird fake president masks, and while sitting in the tree, they were sort of kicking their feet back and forth like a child on the swing would do. We both just sat there like sitting ducks. I was terrified because we hadn't seen one single other person the entire time we'd been out here. All of a sudden, there was a creep with a mask so close to us. I felt like crying, but I was trying to be brave since my girlfriend was already in tears. I knew the person wasn't directly doing anything to us, but the unsettling nature of the situation made us uncomfortable. We watched the guy for about 5 minutes, just sitting there in his tree tilting his head back and forth as he observed us. He then jumped down. The person didn't approach the tent, but that feeling they were going to rush us at any second never went away. It felt like forever that the person was just pacing around outside our tent. Then they just stopped and didn't move. He didn't sway, he just stood still like a statue. A couple minutes later, the person turned to face the tent head on. We could hear them laughing under the mask. The person started to wave right at us, even with the mask on. It felt like the person was staring directly at me. The wave wasn't like a little friendly wave. The person was erratically waving their hand back and forth like they were trying to rip their own arm off or something. The person stopped waving abruptly, did a strange twitch, and then stood stock still. In a muffled voice we could barely hear, he called out to us, Hey guys, bye guys." He then literally ran full speed off into the woods. We just sat there and continued staring out the window all night long. We both may have dozed off at different points, but we mostly stayed awake the entire time. The guy in the mask never did come back. There was no evidence of where he'd come from. That was the most disturbing part. Whoever this was knew that we were there, and we had no idea how long he'd been out there watching us. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. He could have been out there following us for days for all we knew. I guess all things considered, we were lucky since he didn't do anything to us. Even though we were physically unharmed, though, mentally this still left us messed up for a while. We're still thinking about it to this day. We've gone camping several times since that night, but from now on we'll only stay in a cabin with doors we can lock. I don't really like kids. I know that's blunt and very to the point, but it's the truth. I've always had bad luck with children. I'm getting older now, and I need to decide within the next few years if I want to have kids of my own. I spent the first half of the year trying to spend as much time with my brother and my nephew as possible, just to spend some more time around children. A few months back, I got an opportunity to babysit one of my co-workers' children. A year ago, I would have turned this down instantly, but because I was trying to be more open-minded about children, I agreed to watch the kid for a few hours. Not to mention, I could use the extra money. I was relieved to find out the child wasn't a baby like my nephew. He was 7 years old and loved playing games. This was a fun age to interact with, at least for me. We played outside for a while and nothing seemed weird or out of the ordinary. It started to rain though, so instead of getting all wet and muddy, we decided to go inside. The kids started to get a little bit moody when we went in, so I tried to think of some games I liked when I was that age. I thought about hide and seek. That was my favorite game when I was a child. I even played it with my friends when we were in high school, from time to time. Needless to say, he loved the idea. I was surprised when he said he'd never played it before. I had to explain the rules to him, and once he understood the game, he couldn't wait to try it out. I tried to make the game seem like a type of adventure, just to give it some extra flair. We played for a few rounds, but eventually he started to yell at me. I was hiding in spots that were too easy to find. His next turn to seek, I went up to his bedroom and hid underneath his twin bed. Not the greatest hiding spot, but hey, he's a 7-year-old kid. What am I gonna do, not let him win? I heard him shout, "Ready or not, here I come!" I could hear him running back and forth downstairs. I even heard him giggling. I was happy he seemed to be having so much fun. A few seconds later, I happened to turn my head, and that's when I noticed the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. I happened to glance out the window and happened to see some messed up looking lady just standing there right outside of it looking in. I instinctively gasped and covered my mouth. The lady didn't seem to have noticed me though. She was just standing in front of the window not doing anything. Then she leaned over and cupped her hands against it, trying to look around inside. I was terrified she was going to notice me because of the angle, but thankfully she didn't seem to. I started to freak out. I didn't want the kid to walk into the room and be scared of this woman. Everything inside me was telling me to grab the kid and leave right now, but I was paralyzed in that moment. The nightmare just kept getting worse and worse. This woman started to attack the window, clearly trying to get it open. I quickly ruled out the possibility of it being someone familiar. She kept doing the classic look over your shoulder, like she knew what she was doing was wrong. The woman gave the window a few more hard budges, but the window wasn't moving at all. She looked both ways, and then she took off. I just about jumped out of my skin, because not even 10 seconds later, the little boy jumped onto the floor and shouted out, "I found you!" I shrieked so loud the poor kid jumped in surprise. I didn't know if the woman was still outside, or even worse, trying to break in somewhere else. I was trying to think quickly on my feet. I decided to take the kid out for some ice cream, since we were in the middle of summer. I ran to the garage and opened the door, and drove as fast and as far as I could away from that place. I didn't see anyone outside as I pulled away, but I didn't have time to look that far in depth. I know I should have probably just called the cops in that moment, but the kid was having so much fun. I also didn't want to traumatize him. If I was terrified, I didn't even want to know how the kid would feel. The thought was also still lingering in my mind that maybe this woman knew or was related to them somehow. I didn't want to take the chance though, especially after her sketchy demeanor. When we got to the ice cream shop, I texted the boy's mother immediately. I told her everything that happened. I was looking over my shoulder constantly, trying to make sure we hadn't been followed. The mother called the police, which made me feel better. The mother and the cop met us at the ice cream place. We never did tell her son what happened. We just played off that the officer was a friend of his mother's. I stepped away and gave the officer a description of the woman. After receiving this description, the mother was horrified. She didn't recognize the woman at all. She went and stayed with her own mother for a few weeks after, but they've since moved back into that house. They never caught that random woman as far as I know. And as far as she knows, nobody ever tried to break in again. She bought cameras for the house, and she's actively thinking about moving. The nightmare of that woman is too much for her to handle. Months later, she still thanks me all the time for handling the situation like I did. As much as she would have liked for me to call the police and have them catch the woman, she appreciated that I thought about her son's well-being first and foremost. I still have nightmares all the time now, thinking about her demented face looking through the window. Even though the mom appreciates what I did, I feel guilt about the situation. I feel like I should have just called the authorities. Then what would they have done though? Maybe they would have just confronted the woman and let her go. I'm just happy the boy is all right, and I hope that woman never comes back again. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.